Hello and welcome to the first in a series of films relating to genealogy and family history research. And what I'd like to do in this first film is to give you a brief introduction into how to go about researching your own family tree, and hopefully over the course of a series of films I'll be able to expand this into quite a useful database for you, and I'm going to use my own family research as the foundation. So I've been researching my family tree for quite a while now. Started back in the 1970s, and in those days the internet didn't exist. There were no home PCs, information wasn't digitized in any way, and any research you wanted to do had to be done by going to local libraries and local archives and acquiring birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, that sort of thing, looking at printed versions of censuses, whereas now there's a great wealth of information out there on the web, and everything is a lot easier to do from the comfort of your own home. And maybe because of this, family history is becoming an increasingly popular pursuit. Programs such as Who Do You Think You Are on the BBC have attracted a lot of people to find out something about their own family history. But there is such a wealth of material out there now on the internet that it can be a little bit bewildering knowing where to start. So I'm going to sort of take you through the absolute basics to begin with. So you will have a surname. Mine is Astley, so I'm quite lucky in a way, because the name isn't that common. It makes it easier to spot in the records. If you've got a name like Smith or Jones, then it just makes your research a little bit harder. But don't give up, because there are plenty of other ways of tracing your name and finding the needle in the haystack. Now, despite this family crest, I don't want to give you the impression that I come from any kind of aristocratic background. My parents were both very working class. I'll show you a picture of us together on Brighton seafront. So this picture was taken sometime in the 1950s, and I'm the young boy in front there. My father was born in 1912, and he was born close to St Helens in Lancashire into a mining family, and worked as a coal miner from the age of 14 until he joined the army in the 1930s, and was still in the army at the outbreak of the Second World War, and he was lucky to survive right the way through the war. Had a very active war career, which I'll deal with in another episode in this series. And my mother was born in Croydon in 1922, again to a working class family. She as a young woman joined the WAFs and served in the WAFs in the Second World War, and was a telephonist in that career and took that on and worked as a telephonist after the war until her voice began to fail her, and then she had lots of other part-time sort of and full-time menial jobs, ending up as a messenger in the civil service. Now, both of them came from extremely large families. My father had a great many brothers and a couple of sisters, and my mother was the other way round. She had a great many sisters and one brother. So I had lots of aunts and uncles, but the families really didn't keep together. I think that's quite common with large families, that the age gap is so large between the oldest and the youngest children that by the time the younger children are growing up, the older ones have got married and have got families of their own. And on top of that, I only ever saw one of my grandparents, which was my maternal grandmother. Both of my father's parents were living in the north of the country, and both died when I was relatively young. And my mother's father had died long before I was born. He died in the 1930s, and again, I'm going to tell you that story in another episode of this series of films. So my mother has never really spoken about her family to me very much at all. I sort of have the feeling that it was a very disrupted and not a particularly happy family. And she's still alive, but she has absolutely no desire to find out about even who her own grandfather was, and her family background. And my father has passed away, but he was firmly of the opinion that he was born and bred Lancastrian, and that made sense because the name Astley is very common in Lancashire, and he really knew nothing much more than of his own parents, and that was about it. So I had no family photographs, no written records of any kind, so nothing really much for me to go on whatsoever. So I'm going to start with the Astley family and show you how you can start really from scratch and build a very comprehensive family tree, just on the basis of what you can find out. So let's imagine that I'm starting this anew as of 2015. So rather than describe to you the manner in which I had to visit Catherine House in London in order to get certificates and that kind of thing, I'm going to show you how you'd go about it as of today. So what I would strongly recommend, in fact I think it's essential, is that you don't try to organize your own files and keep things written down on paper. Once you start getting a lot of names on your family tree, it's very, very hard to tidily draw them onto a piece of paper. Acquire some software to do it for you, and the most common commercially available software is Family Tree Maker, which I've been using since 2005, and it's essential, really. You can't do without it. There is an issue here, though, which I should really deal with before I go much further. Genealogy and family research is really big business nowadays. There's a lot of money made by selling software such as this and selling genealogical data via various websites. And when the web was born and digitization of records became commonplace, the people most in the most advantageous position to exploit this were the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, I believe is their proper name. And why was that? Well, the Mormon Church has an extreme interest in genealogical research itself, and the reason that is because they believe that their ancestors should be rebaptized into the Mormon faith long after their deaths. But they also will rebaptize everybody, any person's name that they acquire. They will try to, or they believe they are baptizing those people into the true faith. So way back before the days of the internet, Mormons would travel the world tracing parish registers in England, for instance, visiting local churches, and building up an enormous database. It's reputedly kept in files within the hollow of a mountain near Salt Lake City. And I have seen film of this vast archive, and I don't think the Mormons even attempt to conceal what they're doing. They're perfectly genuinely motivated, but that does cause an issue with people who have some kind of conflicting faith. So the Church of England in Britain, for instance, when they cottoned on to what the Mormons were doing, became very suspicious of particularly Americans visiting local churches and asking to see the parish registers. But be that as it may, they'd had this enormous database and they were quite happy to share it, and quite happy for subscribers on the internet to correspond with them so that they could then glean more records, more names from everybody's individual research. So the whole thing blossomed over the internet. And as you can see, Family Tree Maker are linked to Ancestry.com, which is basically the genealogical website that grew out of the Mormons database, which is known as the International Genealogical Index. So it's a fait accompli, really. Whether or not you're upset by the idea of your ancestors being suborned into the Mormon faith, that's a matter of your own opinion. It's done. And the flip side of that is that there is just this enormous database, wealth of information that you can tap into, and the Mormons encourage you to do so. And that does mean as well that if you have a Mormon temple in your neighborhood, as I do, you are quite free to go there, and they will invite you in and allow you to explore this database within their own precincts. So I'm completely atheist about the whole thing anyway, so I have no qualms about using their facilities and using their resources, but I should really make you aware. And if you really have difficulty with that, then I'm sure there are other software packages available other than Family Tree Maker. I couldn't name what they are, and there are certainly some other genealogical websites that I'll go into in a minute. So, having got that out of the way, I'm going to show you how to proceed using Family Tree Maker. So let's go back to that point where I had virtually no idea of my family tree and show you the software with my name on it and the name of my parents, and we'll assume that's all I've got to work with. So here we are, not much of a tree at the moment. I've entered my name, my date of birth, and my mother's name, Daisy Heath, and her date of birth, and my father, Arthur Astley, and his dates. So my father's told me the name of his father, which was Richard, and I know my father's date of birth, which was the 18th of January 1912, and that allows me to search for his birth certificate. Now, ever since 1837, it's been a requirement by law for people to register the births of their children and the deaths of relatives, and to register when they get married. So you have a record going back to 1837 of every single birth, death and marriage that took place in the country. Now, how do you search for an index? Well, back when I started, I literally had to go to a local archive. In my case, it was Catherine House in London, and they had the indices for all these registered births, deaths and marriages in enormous volumes on the shelves, and organised alphabetically and by year and by quarter years. And you simply had to find the relevant date. So in my case, I would have had to look for the first quarter of 1912 under A for Astley, and searched for the index number of my father's date of birth. But nowadays you can do that online, so I'm going to show you a few websites which are the most commonly used where you could do that. Okay, so I've already mentioned this site, Ancestry.com. All these sites have far more than just the certificates on them. I'll come back to that later again. So there's Ancestry.com, which has got a huge wealth of information on it. And then there's, this is the one I use, which is Find My Past. These people often sponsor family history programs on the TV, so you've probably seen their adverts. They have a very similar kind of database to Ancestry.com. There's not much to choose between the two of them. Or you could try Genes Reunited, which has got a slight twist on the whole thing. It's got all those records, but on top of that, you can actually put your family tree on there. So you, instead of buying software, you could use this site, and then you can search for other people who have links, matches to your family tree. But as I say, I tend to use Find My Past. I do use Genes Reunited. I subscribe to this site as well, but I tend to use it for slightly different reasons. Again, I'll come on to that, I'm sure, in later episodes in this series. Right, so here we are. We're logged into Find My Past now, and I'm searching under birth, marriage, death, and parish records. And this gives me this search page. So I've entered my father's name, Arthur Astley, and I know that he was born in 1912. And I've also added a little bit extra, his mother's maiden name, which I knew, which was Lancaster. And then you click search, and it will come up with all the people who correspond to that. And there is only one Arthur Astley who corresponds with the mother's maiden name of Lancaster, and that is this entry here. Now, the indices did change over time, and I think it was only around 1909 that they started to add the mother's maiden name. So as you go further back into the 19th century, you can't always use that trick to narrow down the search, but it's a useful way of eliminating spurious names that aren't related to you. And then you click either on the transcription or the image. So I've gone for the transcription, and that's my father's details. He was born in the district of Warrington in Lancashire, and it gives you a volume number and a page number, and it's that district and the volume and page number that you need in order to be able to organise to order the certificate. And you do that from the General Register Office, and you can do that online. This is their website. So you log into them and you type in the details of the volume number and the page number, and they charge you, I think it's about £9 per certificate, so it's quite an expensive pursuit. You don't really want to get too many misses, too many certificates by mistake of people who aren't related to you, and they will return to you in the post, depending on how busy they are. It usually takes about a week, but it can be longer than that, and you'll get the birth certificate come back to you in the post. And if you're using the Family Tree Maker software, as soon as it comes to you in the post, you can scan it and put an image onto the software, so that it's safely stored on your computer. And they look like this. It will tell you the place of birth. So in my father's case, he was born at number 10 Gibraltar Cottages. It's in a place, if you look above, it's described as Newton in Macclesfield. Now that's a bit odd. I mean, obviously they knew where they were when they made the certificate out, but nowadays there's an Ashton in Macclesfield. No, there isn't. Yes, there is. There's an Ashton in Macclesfield and a Newton the Willows, and Newton in Macclesfield, I can only imagine, is between the two of them. And it also tells you the father's name, the father's profession. He was a coal hewer, so that fits as well, because I knew my dad came from a mining family. And the mother's name is Esther Astley, formerly Lancaster. So if I hadn't known that already, that would have been a useful item of information to glean. So there we are. We're off on the first step of a long investigation. I've got quite a lot of information already that I can use. Now I happen to know that every 10 years there's a census taken, and they happen in the year 1 of each decade. So I know that the year before this birth of my father, a census would have been taken, and I can be fairly confident that even though my father won't be there because he's not born, that Richard and Esther will be living, hopefully, still at 10 Gibraltar Cottages. So my inclination would be to look up the 1911 census next and see who they're there with, whether they've got any other children and so on. And I happen to know that because I know the names of my dad's brothers, so I'm kind of pretending that I know less than I do for the sake of description here. Or I could alternatively go back through the marriage indices, going back from this period backwards in time until I find a reference for a Richard Astley marrying an Esther Lancaster, and then order their marriage certificate in the same way that I ordered this birth certificate. But first of all, I'll show you what the 1911 census looks like. So I go back to the Find My Past website, and this time I'm searching under censuses, and I have various details. So I'm going to enter the name of Richard Astley at the top there. I know that the year is 1911 when the census was taken, and I know the district is Warrington, and I'm going to put down the bottom there the name Esther, because I know his wife's name is Esther, and then we're going to search under that, and it comes up with two Richard Astleys, one born in 1885 and the other born in 1910. So clearly the 1910 one isn't my grandfather, but as it happens is my uncle, but I don't know that theoretically at this stage. And this time I'm going to look under the photographic image rather than the transcript, because you do often find that the transcriptions can be slightly inaccurate, because these pages are often difficult to read, and I'd much rather read them myself than rely on someone else who's probably done it in a bit of a hurry. Okay, and this is a typical page from the 1911 census. In that census, each household has its own page. This is the first time that happened, and the house owner, or the head of the household, was expected to fill the census in himself. Up until then, people had been employed to go around knocking on doors and taking details down. But this is a self-registering, self-completion, whatever you want to call it, form. And you can see down the bottom right-hand corner, it's been signed by Richard Astley, and he's given the address as 10 Gibraltar Cottages, so I know I've got the correct family here. And there's a lot of information on this that I wouldn't normally have expected to glean. Some of it I would. For instance, they always have the place of birth, and that would have been the first surprise to me, because it's got Richard Astley was born in Wolverhampton, and not, as my father would have thought, in Lancashire. So he comes from the West Midlands, so my father's Lancastrian roots unfortunately don't go back that far. It's got his wife Esther, and then a son called Richard Astley, who is my uncle. But underneath that is this really peculiar entry, because my father had another brother called James, and he was born before Richard and Esther were married, and that was not by any means an unusual occurrence at this time. I've got so many examples of that on my family tree that I couldn't count how many. But for some reason, this family always cut themselves up about this birth out of wedlock. So poor James was never allowed to use the name Astley. So he spent his entire life, my Uncle Jim, being known as James Lancaster. And in fact, if you look across, they don't even because he wasn't born during the period of marriage, he's not even accounted for in the number of children born in this marriage. There's just the one, and that's Richard. So that's one story anyway. And they're both Richard and James are born in Earlstown in Lancashire, which is in fact is a very neighbouring area. There's not much difference between Warrington and Earlstown. But also on here is an Ellen Astley, who was born in Wolverhampton, who is Richard's mother. And that's fantastic. You don't always, well, you do get mothers obviously living with their children, but it's an added bonus to this census that I now know the name of my great grandmother, Ellen. I don't know her maiden name, but it's a big help. And there's also another girl there called Alice Astley, who is put down as my grandfather's sister, 7 years old. So that would be Ellen Astley's daughter. And that's a little bit more of a puzzle. I'll go into that in more detail in another film, but it's not a story for today. But this census page also tells me that Richard and Esther have been married 2 years. So the next thing I'm going to do, I can hone in now to around the 1909 period, and find and obtain their marriage certificate, and on that will be the names of both Richard and Esther's fathers, but I principally at the moment want the name of Richard's father, who would be Ellen's husband, in order to get the name of my great grandfather. So I'll just show you this process one more time just to reinforce the point. I go back to Find My Past, to the that particular website, and I'm searching now under births, deaths and marriages, but specifically for marriages and divorces. And a useful tip is never to put in too much detail. If you start putting in things like district and so on, or precise years, sometimes you can be slightly off and miss the particular record that you're aiming at. So all I've put in is Richard Astley's name, Esther Lancaster's name, and I haven't even put in a year, because there can't have, in history, that there can't have been that many Richard Astleys marrying Esther Lancasters, and I'll just try that first of all and see what I get. And the result comes up as this. There's only one match, so I can be fairly confident this is the right one. And you'll notice straight away it was wise of me not to put in too much specific detail, because the marriage actually took place in 1908, so it's probably right at the end of 1908, in the last quarter, and it took place in the district of Prescott, which is a neighbouring registration district. It's virtually the same place again, but had I put something like Earlstown or Warrington and been specific, I wouldn't have come across that record straight away. So it's always useful to remember, don't be over precise, and then see what you get. If it's 5 or 6 results, there's probably only going to be one that matches your idea of where you should be looking anyway, but it's better to get more than none at all. And this is the transcription rather than the actual page itself, and they always sort of pair off spouses on these. I think they have 2 couples on each page, so it's got that Richard Astley either married Esther Lancaster, or I think that says Nancy Rigsby, but I know that when I order the certificate it's going to have Esther Lancaster's name on it. So I make a note of the volume and the page number again, and the district, Prescott this time, and I go back to that Records Office website, and another £9, and I'll get the marriage certificate back in the post. And here it is, and this has given me a few more pointers. I now know Richard Astley's father's name. He was called James, so he is my great-grandfather, and it's got his occupation, and he was a miner as well. And it also gives Esther's father's name. He was a James Lancaster. So that first child, my uncle, James Lancaster, is either named after, he's named after one of these two Jameses. It's hard to tell which. And James Lancaster as well was a miner. And the couple were both living at 71 Newton Road when they got married, which explains the presence of my oldest uncle, James Lancaster, before the marriage. And what else has it got? It's got, I already knew the ages of Richard and Esther from the 1911 census, but it confirms their dates of birth. So I've now got a lot more to go on. The next thing I'm going to do is obtain Richard Astley's birth certificate. I know he was born in Wolverhampton, and I now know the names of both his parents, James Astley and Ellen, and I know the year that it took place in, so it's not going to be too difficult to find. And just added thing on this certificate, you always get the marriage certificates witnessed. In this case, I don't know who either Timothy Coyle or Mary Dolby or whatever it says, Crosby. I don't know either of those. I don't recognise them as family members, but occasionally you'll get a family member, and it will give you a little bit more of a pointer about who's around at particular times. So hopefully that's given you a sort of basic idea of the rudimentary steps in tracing your family tree. You basically follow it as a paper trail. You just follow it back using alternating birth and marriage certificates, and confirming your findings using the 10-yearly census records. Of course, it's never that simple. There's lots of transcription errors, that kind of thing. You'll see a lot of these people, especially as you get back into the 19th century, couldn't read and write, and consequently things were often misspelt, and especially the surname Astley gets changed to Asley, Atley, Hasley, all kinds of things like that. But if things go well, that's the way you trace your family tree. So I'm going to stop at that point. There's not many names on the tree at the moment, and ignore my mother's side. I followed a similar process with them, but I'm going to follow the Astley line in the next couple of films, and slowly show you a few more ways of tracing your tree. So hope that's been of use, and see you in part 2.